今天您将收看的是
英国著名思想史学家彼得·沃森新作《20世纪思想史：从弗洛伊德到互联网》，梳理现代人类境况的观念脉络，一部拒绝简化的思想全史。
大家好，观众朋友们，您现在看到的是今晚我们读书。英国著名的思想史学家彼得·沃森的专著《20世纪思想史：从弗洛伊德到互联网》最近呢出版了中文版。在这本书当中呢，他用碎片化的方式记录了100年来重要的科学文化的高峰。那在今天的节目当中，我们一起来了解这一部独特的思想史。
英国著名思想史学家彼得·沃森向来以大格局的写作闻名于西方世界，思想史从火到弗洛伊德便是其代表作。近期他的新作《20世纪思想史：从弗洛伊德到互联网》又史诗般地展现了20世纪从弗洛伊德到互联网兴起的全部知识发展历程，梳理了现代人类境况的观念脉络，可谓是历史领域的一大壮举。沃森着迷的历史不是人类永无止境的战争和风起云涌的政治，而是人类如何认识世界、认识自己的历史。
What I did in this case was that I read a lot, and then I talked to a number of recognized historians in Britain, in America, in Europe, and so forth. And I asked them, in their field, what were the three most important elements in their field in the 20th century. When I asked that, I mean, I could have got a whole myriad number of answers, but in fact there was quite a large overlap between one historian and another. And so that's how I selected the items or the features to include. And then I think the whole point of history, I still think that narrative history as a story, is more interesting to more people than thematic history. And so that's where the skill, if there is any, resides or lies in forming a narrative out of those disparate entities to give people the idea of history moving forward.
20世纪既是人类的多事之秋，也是思想进步的辉煌世纪。在这个世纪，全人类在征服、对峙、战争和解放的裹挟中曲折前进，求同存异。我们也在各大学科中取得了微观粒子、基因结构、现代主义等重大发现。彼得·沃森用精准和优美的叙述笔法，将人类在20世纪取得的思想发展娓娓道来，帮助21世纪的读者理解我们如何抵达当今的世界，未来又会去向何方。
I narrow it down through talking to historians and arriving at what I think are the most important issues. I was attracted to this story by one particular historian, Sir Isaiah Berlin from Oxford, because he said that he was born in Russia in 1904 and he died, I think, in 1999 in Oxford. And so his life spanned the century. And he was asked what was the most extraordinary thing about his long life. And his answer was, and I think it's an interesting and good answer, that he lived through the most unimaginable horrors of 2 world wars and revolutions everywhere and so forth. And yet he had a happy life and a productive life. And he was amazed that that could happen. And I think it is one of the most extraordinary things about the 20th century is that it was appalling politically. There were these terrible wars and millions of people were killed all over the world, and yet in intellectual and artistic and cultural matters it was a great success. It was very varied and it was, one might almost say, a lot of fun. It was very, very interesting. And so that's in a way the most surprising thing and one of the most important things about the century. This is the first century, I think, where science overwhelms the humanities and history and the classics that existed right throughout until the end of the 19th century, till the First World War, really.
1900年1月6日星期六，在20世纪诞生还不到1个星期的时候，一篇书评出现在奥地利首都维也纳，它将完全颠覆人类对自身的认知方式。从严格意义上说，书评中介绍的这本书在1年前的11月就已经在维也纳和莱比锡出版了。但这篇书评诞生于1900年，而它正是让大众第一次听说了这本书。这本书就是《梦的解析》，其作者是一位来自摩拉维亚的小镇弗莱贝格的44岁犹太医生，名叫西格蒙德·弗洛伊德。弗洛伊德恰当地将梦的解析视为他最重要的成就。在这本书里，弗洛伊德的人性理论的4大理论基石首次获得了集中阐述：无意识、心理压抑、幼稚性欲，以及对心理的3重划分：自我及自我意识，超我及广义上的良知，以及本我及无意识的原始生物表达。
I think for the beginning of a book, you want some vivid episodes that take place very close to one another in terms of time. Obviously, some of the events are more important than others, like the interpretation of dreams is more important than the discoveries in archaeology. But I wanted in the first chapter to show to readers that the book had a wide range of interests, and it seems to me that archaeology has had a very productive 20th century, and so I wanted to introduce that idea. Clearly, Picasso was probably the most important artist of the 20th century, so I wanted to get him in quickly. And it was also important to say that the world before the First World War was very different from what it is now. For instance, Paris was much more important in world historical terms in 1900 than it was in 2000. Paris was probably the most important city in 1900, but that's far from being the case in 2000, when obviously Beijing had come on as an important centre. London and New York and Washington were important centres. So all that kind of thinking goes into the way you start the book to show how the world both was and wasn't like the one we're living in now.
1900年10月25日，就在马克思·普朗克将写有自己重要方程式的明信片寄给海因里希·鲁本斯的几天之后，巴勃罗·毕加索搭乘从巴塞罗那开来的列车，抵达在巴黎的奥赛火车站。1900年的巴黎到处是才华横溢的人物，这座城市拥有70份日报和35万盏电气路灯，第一份米其林指南也刚刚问世。它是阿尔弗雷德·雅里的故乡，他的剧作《与比王》堪称对莎士比亚作品怪诞的模仿。他讲述了一个肥胖的傀儡国王妄图通过大屠杀来占领波兰的故事，就连观看了该剧首演的 W.B. 叶芝也被震惊了。研究放射现象的居里夫人、象征主义诗人斯特凡·马拉美以及印象派音乐大师克劳德·德彪西都居住于此。
I have a chapter on French culture, which is called, in English, is called The French Connection, and it's a play on the film The French Collection, and you can't really. French culture is in many ways different from Anglo-Saxon culture, so it's difficult to bring that in, except at the point in time when it was very influential, which was the 1960s and the 1970s, and that gave rise, it was French culture which in a sense gave rise to postmodernism, which is a very important era of thought at the end of the 20th century that's now fading. So I mention this as an example of how it both fits in and doesn't fit in to a synthesis.
We're going
法国贩毒网是威廉·弗莱德金于1971年拍摄的有关毒品流入美国和黑手党的电影。其实说的不是法国的事情，其中有些恶棍是讲法语的加拿大人，但是片名很受欢迎。他抓住了哲学、心理学、语言学、认识论以及历史学、人类学和音乐等领域一些值得关注的内容。这就是法国思想和盎格鲁撒克逊思想之间的明显差异。不过，二者同样硕果累累，又富有争议。在美国、英国和其他英语世界，达尔文的原叙事方兴未艾，但在法国，特别是20世纪60年代末以及70和80年代，19世纪的另外2种原叙事再度兴起：弗洛伊德主义和马克思主义。区分这些理论并非易事，因为有些作者同时支持2种理论，还有些德国和法国的作者文风深奥矛盾，他们的作品翻译后语言显得更加笨拙晦涩。
Because I think a lot of French postmodern culture has faded now. I mean, I think that it was very important in the 60s and 70s and to some extent in the 80s. But I think that a lot of its ideas, I mean, if you read the book closely, I'm quite critical of Barthes and the French culture in which he thrived. France is, it's still very different from Anglo-Saxon culture. And you go into a bookshop in Paris, and there are walls and walls of books on psychoanalysis and on philosophy. Now, in Britain and America, there's maybe a shelf on psychoanalysis, and maybe 3 shelves on philosophy. All of these things have really faded, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon culture. And so, I mean, I think Barthes is difficult to understand at the best of times, and he's difficult to understand in translation, and it's difficult to remember what he's about 40 years later.
巴特的观点是，现代文化比我们的眼睛看到的还要丰富。现代男女被各种象征和符号包围，这些象征和符号传达的有关现代世界的信息，不亚于传统的文字形式。与萨特一样，巴特因为马克思主义而憎恨资产阶级，他对现代日常生活的象征和符号分析取得了极大的成功，这使他开始批评结构主义者的科学姿态。在《文之乐》中，巴特写道，在文本的舞台上没有脚蹬，文本的背后没有主动者，观众席里面也没有被动者，不存在主体和客体。当我们的身体追求自身观点的时候，文本的愉悦就产生了。与雷蒙德·威廉斯一样，巴特知道一切写作和创作都受制于作品的文化语境。他想帮助人们冲破桎梏，使阅读摆脱被动行为，变得更主动，最后变得愉快。在盎格鲁撒克逊国家，他受到了众多负面评价，不过他变得更有影响力了。
But I thought that I gave quite a lot of space to the counterculture, which includes a lot of pop culture, and I just thought that was far more important than a lot of pop music. I was in the same class at school as Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, who was a good friend of mine. Sadly, he died. But there was a brief moment, I think, in the 60s when pop music was much more important than it is now, because it was linked to the young generation. It had a political significance that it hasn't really had since. Or rather, but I still felt that the counterculture had a more enduring influence than someone like Bob Dylan, who I like and I have nothing against. I do give quite a lot of space to the counterculture, of which he was a part, but other people I thought were more important to include than he. Popular music has become very self-referential. It doesn't really expand. People don't use pop song words like they use poetry or television programs. Their language seeps into the everyday conversation. I'm not sure the pop songs do.
丹尼尔·贝尔认为，文化之所以为头等重要，首先是因为艺术不断地寻求创新的形式和感觉，其次是因为文化现在不再是权威道德的来源，而是新的愉悦感的生产者。贝尔认为，现代主义在20世纪30年代就开始走向终结，到20世纪60年代已经枯竭。社会和艺术在市场中相遇，其结果是审美情调和高雅文化的概念不复存在。当代社会存在着大量的错位，事物在技术经济层面还受到效率、理性、秩序和纪律的控制，而支配文化的却是及时的感官和情绪满足及自我的放纵。人们要为现代主义付出巨大的代价。现代性即个人主义，个人努力重塑自我，如有必要，还要重塑社会，以便加以设计和选择。它意味着拒绝天定或神定的秩序，拒绝外部权威和集体权威，将自我作为行动的唯一参考点。也许贝尔最深刻的观点是，现代文化强调体验，尤其是将观众置于中心的体验。观众与艺术家或艺术作品的对话已经没有意义了。
You know, you always, looking back in history, all politicians are born, they die, there are dates, there are reigns, there are treaties, there are wars, they all have dates. Whereas in ideas, there are no dates, or the dates are a lot less certain. And so the fun in it is, of the interest in it, is to create a structure that means something, but may or may not be the same as the political structure. And I think the most interesting question of all, the most interesting book of all to write, which would be very, very ambitious, is there a link between political structure and cultural? And that's one of the pleasures of the history of ideas. You can come up with these dates and these periods that lie outside the political spectrum and enable us to look at history in a different way. So if you're asking what you think my achievement is in my own way, that was what I would say is the most interesting thing, to give a different structure, to make people think about history in a somewhat different way, as opposed to purely political history.
纽约时报专栏作家戴维·布鲁克斯最近在文章中提及，互联网上能够获取的信息犹如一条浑浊的信息河流。这话当然说得有点过，但它的核心意思是，互联网上的信息未经提炼和归纳，其中有着太多纷繁复杂的细节，还称不上是知识。布鲁克斯的观点得到了诸多证据的支撑，而尽管互联网毫无疑问给我们带来了好处，却也可能让我们进入新的无知时代。思想综合是20世纪思想史的另一大特征。人们在理解事件和思想时喜欢使用框架，因为它能帮助我们进入思想的语境，咀嚼它，记忆它。如果没有框架，思想与思想的叠加只会是混乱的集合，而没有任何条理可言。
I think that there are a number of people who boost the internet, and they say things like, there's so much information on the internet that you don't really read to read. You can always get whatever you want. And I think it's very important to distinguish between information and knowledge. And the American journalist David Brooks wrote in the New York Times, he said, every day we're drowning in what he calls a dirty river of information, as one fact after another washes over us. And what do you hold on to as it goes by? And this is the problem that we all face. And I think that a useful antidote to that, and I really do think it's worth saying, that if you read this book, and if you read my other book that came out last year, Ideas, it gives a synthesis. It gives a structure, an infrastructure to history. And it doesn't really matter whether that infrastructure is correct. Obviously, it's helpful that it is sort of correct. But if you have an infrastructure, when facts come your way, you can immediately assimilate them onto this infrastructure. It helps your memory. It helps your sanity too, I think, to know all this. But I think that it helps information become knowledge, because life must be, to some extent, our intellectual life and our cultural life must be about synthesis. We must start, as we become adult, to organize the facts that we're learning into some system so that we remember them, so that we organize them, and so that we understand them.
20世纪确实在诸多方面大获全胜，但在其他方面也承受了难以化解的灾难。中国的读者对此想必体会颇深，这也是为什么最后我采用了爱尔兰大诗人 W.B. 叶芝的诗句《惊骇之美》作为英文书名。一切都变了，那样彻底，一种惊骇之美已经诞生。写作这本书的时候，对我来说，这2句诗便是整个20世纪的墓志铭。惊骇之美也就成了本书英国版的书名。
通过彼得沃森的这部专著，我们了解了20世纪人类在科学文化方面的重要的贡献。好，以上就是今天节目的全部内容，非常感谢各位的收看，让我们下一次再见。
下期您将收看的是唐大郎，海派报人代表，被誉为江南第一支笔。2019年出版的《唐大郎纪念集》展现了这位正直爱国的知识分子的一生。